Darkly Splendid Abodes, the official podcast of Toronto Thelema. Exploring, if you will, practical philosophy, from science and the workings of the mind to spirituality, esotericism, and magic. Stooping down, dipping my wings, I came into the darkly splendid abodes. Marjorie Cameron was an artist, poet, actress, and magician. Jack Parsons believed he'd conjured her through his Babalon Working, and she would come to see herself as the vehicle for the incarnation of Babalon in the world. Rosemary Stehlik and I will take a closer look at this maverick artist as we continue to explore women of the occult. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
Love is a law, love under will.
Welcome back, Rosemary.
Thank you again for having me.
Today we are going to be taking a look at Marjorie Cameron.
That's right. Who, interestingly enough, is eloquently dovetailing Lady Frida Harris into the California OTO.
The Californians, yeah. Who she had no truck with.
Absolutely no use for those Californians.
Those wild Californians, yeah. I think we had mentioned Kenneth Anger showing his film in England.
Correct, yes.
And she was present for that showing, his film, Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome.
I believe it was he's trying to pay homage to the legacy of Aleister Crowley, but Lady Frida Harris was having none of it.
This doesn't represent Thelema or Thelemites.
and was pretty outspoken about it in his face. So
yeah, apparently she was browbeating him so badly. Eventually, he just gave up and left.
His absolutely humble offering of a gift was tossed angrily to the floor as he stormed out. Oh, Kenneth, love you. Who is still alive.
Yeah, amazingly enough.
He
refuses to relinquish this world.
I would love to be able to have the privilege for us to interview Kenneth
Wouldn't that be
Anger.
Amazing? Wouldn't it be cool if... I always think about these kinds of things because there's so many people that I would love, my heroes, that I would love to meet, and I constantly fantasize about what it would be like, and then unfortunately I miss my opportunities with so many of them. So wouldn't it be cool if we managed to actually chew the ear?
Seriously, he'd chew our ears, I think. The great Magus, now in his 90s.
Yeah.
Profound.
Yeah, and...
the Californians.
The Californians. We had... Jack Parsons as being somebody who, I want to say that he was kind of a good point to start from.
Absolutely.
Which makes total sense with Marjorie Cameron. It's funny because as I'm thinking about it, just the Californian group, this is like the Agape Lodge of OTO in its incarnation as it came back into being.
That's
in
right.
California.
And I love hearing you saying it, because I often say Agape Lodge. Tomato.
Yeah, Thelema. I was going to give a completely unknown pronunciation of Thelema for a second there, but...
But that was the lodge that was prevailing in California.
Yeah.
Carrying on the legacy of our beloved Aleister Crowley.
And there was so many characters in this lodge, like Wilfred T. Smith is the lodge master for quite a bit of time there, and he himself seems to have been quite the character who instigated this whole kind of bohemian world that seemed to develop around.
Yes,
the
it
lodge.
almost became like a mecca of of creative, iconoclastic energy.
Almost like the energies that this thing took on were what laid the blueprint for not just the beatnik movement to come, the beat movement, I should probably call it, rather than
the beat
beatnik.
movement. Yeah.
But, being as beatnik was a derogatory term towards it, but then also the hippie movement and the whole
the psychedelic revolution to follow after that, of course.
Yeah, exactly. And there's like so many positives and so many mind expanding things that came out of this. A lot of negatives, of course, as well. But
and such an ecosystem, like the convergence of so many people, places, and things into a vortex of revolutionary energy to welcome in the new aeon, which was the desire, of course.
Yeah, extremely exemplary of these new aeonic energies, much to the chagrin of Aleister Crowley at the time.
That's right.
He was the stuffy old man, go figure, who is...
These children are out of control.
I hear one of them's got some damn fool ideas about making a moon child. And so he was critical of Jack Parsons apparently wanting to create some kind of a moon child and having this Babalon working that he was doing.
Right.
And he was doing it, as a matter of fact, with... See, there's so many characters that come into play here. It's
actually
ridiculous.
Mind expanding.
You can't make this stuff up. If you wrote a story with all these elements to it, it would just be, you'd take you out of the story because it's just ridiculous at some point. You're like, okay, come on.
Well, just to begin with, as you wisely placed Jack Parsons as the milestone for this convergence, this vortex of energy, you have his brilliance as a rocket engineer and a chemist by day, and an occultist, a magician, a magical worker by night. And all of the converging communities and people and societies that kind of found each other and became catalysts in each other's lives to really push themselves beyond their own perceived limitations as a human entity.
Absolutely. Yeah, and he really enabled this whole group to continue to subsist, just by virtue of the fact that he had inherited a mansion and put it immediately to that use.
That's right, which he called the parsonage.
Yeah.
And so it became almost like for lack of a better term, a commune before communes.
Yeah.
Attracting every wayfaring soul and revolutionary and visionary that boasted the presence of such eccentric characters as L. Ron Hubbard as a lodger. Who
would become his co-worker in this Babalon Working.
Yes, absolutely. Subsequently, not only scribe, but also entrepreneurial partner in their visions, because of course, as we backtrack, one of Jack Parsons' talents of many was his obsessive focus on revolutionizing jet-propelled machinery. And he placed so much of his natural gift for this engineering prowess that he had into his interests, that he was a part of a group of engineers that came to be known as the Suicide Squad because they experimented in the desert with such profound explosive technology that it was basically like a bunch of rebels just seeing where they could take things, right?
Yeah, and I mean, he was running pretty fast and loose, at least it seemed, because he was not the sort of university-level mind that these others were. I mean, he certainly was that kind of a mind, but he was not as well-educated and all that sort of thing. He was kind of a maverick in that sense.
Absolutely, and to jump onto your statement of him as a maverick, this is what makes it so natural to see him engaging in occult workings by night that nobody knew of. I find that duality where other people would have seen it as absolutely bonkers at the time.
Yeah.
I actually see it as somebody who was striving to break through the stratosphere of consciousness and into the future. And so with that being the foundation of his soul energy, it makes sense that he would draw like a magnet the presence of Marjorie Cameron eventually into his life.
Yeah, and this is the ultimate. It may seem a little meandering to to the casual listener. It all comes together.
It all ties in.
Yes, so that's right. L. Ron Hubbard and Jack Parsons were in the desert performing rituals to invoke.
They were doing the John D. Edward Kelly.
Yeah, they were doing. Apparently, it sounds like a bit of a mishmash. So it wasn't like they were doing it in the, sort of by the book kind of way. They were taking a bunch of different things relating to that and doing, sort of stirring it in a big pot. And their intention, or at least Jack's intention, because essentially it was him driving this whole working. His intention was to invoke the energies of Babalon, who, of course, appears in The Vision and the Voice and is alluded to in the Book of the Law, although the name Babalon does not come up in the Book of the Law. So his intention seems to have been to invoke the energies of Babalon into the world, and even to the point of potentially incarnating Babalon in the flesh, in a physical being.
Yes.
And so they were doing this in the desert together. And who should respond to the call?
The one and only Marjorie Cameron, who, of course, in her own right had a very powerful presence and was extremely desirous of breaking out of any stereotypical role that she felt her era expected of women to fulfill. So quite early on in her life, showing a propensity for the arts in a very strong way. She almost, in some of the writings that we read about her in childhood, strikes me as somebody that had synesthesia or something. The person that can like smell purple or
see colors for music and sound and that sort of thing.
Definitely sounded like someone who had that aspect about her. She related very much as a child to mystical otherworldly dimensions and had shown an early gift for the arts. And so between like her artistic aspirations and her natural drive as an individual that wanted to live a greater life than she came from, born in a very humble village or town, Belle Plaine in Iowa or something like that. Her aspirations led her to join WAVE at a very young age, which was recruiting women during the Second World War to help with the mission, the military mission of the United States. So she would have been a part of the extra labor to hold up the mantle of the power of the United States while the boys were off fighting. And she ended up joining the Navy. So these were Navy women that had very, very determined alpha roles in the cause, sort of thing. So she had a military background, which is fascinating. Didn't last long, but she did have. I think it's more of a testament to the strong nature of her being. Of her personality.
So in the military, she became a draftsperson, putting her artistic skills to use, and she ended up becoming very admired for her draftsmanship.
That's right. In a lot of the application of cartography being one of them.
Yeah, which is pretty cool. That's and she's described as being sort of having masculine qualities, and I feel like this is kind of nicely exemplary of how she's both hyper feminized and hyper masculinized, if that's the correct terminology to use for it. But
I can see that. Yeah. She definitely, and interestingly enough, because as she moves into the deeper aspects of her life and experience, she seems to find herself in extremely competitive circles, not only the military, but later on down the road in the realms of Hollywood, in a male-dominated film industry. So from the absolutely wonderful book written by Spencer Kansa that both Darren and I read in preparation, he talks very much about that. He talks about perhaps her strong-willed nature being perceived as masculine because there were specific expectations of how women should behave, and she definitely broke through that glass ceiling.
Yeah. Yeah, you get the sense that people were just struck by her.
Yeah.
And she seems also aloof, which makes total sense, kind of, given everything. It's just sort of par for the course for anybody of our ilk, I think, to be somewhat outsider and to be standing somewhat aloof and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. And so I could see that laying the foundation for her being a very formidable occultist down the road in order to kind of keep that stoic space in the eye of the hurricane.
Yeah. Yeah, and she seemed to have a great strength, just the type of person who could walk into a room and just suddenly all eyes would be on her, you know.
And at some point, it should be very important to note that she did drop the Marjorie part of her name and decided to go by a mononym of Cameron. Again, I feel it was her way of rebirthing herself into this sort of strong, towering embodiment of the Babalon current.
I like the fact that it's like very well could have come from the military as well, just from force of habit.
That's right.
You know, referring to people by their last name.
Absolutely.
And I almost feel like later on people would refer to her sarcastically as Marjorie just to get under her skin.
Like, utilizing it as an insult.
But to bring things back, we have her arriving out of nowhere, seemingly out of nowhere, at the parsonage one day.
That's right.
And this is after, I guess I should say during the Babalon Working. And it seems to Jack to have been in direct response to it.
That's right.
There's a point where she, later on down the line, is able to discover, after Jack's death, she's going through his diaries and his leftover materials, which she kept hold of for some time. And she discovered all this stuff in hindsight, but she didn't know it at the time.
That's right.
She was oblivious to this whole thing.
And, focusing on that Babalon Working, she was very much considered to be the elemental of Jack's invocation. Now, I really wish that we had some evidence of what exactly he did in that circle, but it is definitely a synchronicity that I feel was so deeply karmic that it affected Cameron's life unto the end. And it was a thing that was both a phantasm and a muse in her artistic existence. And she also embodies the consciousness and sort of vitality of somebody that sees art as life and life as art. I deeply relate to that. One of my favorite things to say is, I want to be a living work of art in perpetual motion. And I see her living that way. She definitely embodied that. Yeah. And I mean, just to backtrack a little, if we're going to get more intimate about Cameron, I'd like to share a little bit of a background of her cosmological being. Cool. She was born on April 23rd of 1922, which makes her a Taurus. Makes total sense. And she's considered, at this point of history, to be an American actress, artist, and occultist. who was, of course, destined to move into a higher plane of the occult by the end of her life, sealed by her union with Jack Parsons.
Mm-hmm.
And many great works of film, poetry, art, ritual have been birthed from that star-crossed union.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's amazing how influential she's been.
Absolutely.
And even in spite, you could say,
Mm-hmm.
in spite of herself, because she was not prone to showing her work very often. There was a couple of showings, but you could count them, I think, on one hand.
Yes.
And not only that, but she was in a few different fits over the years. She had destroyed her own works or didn't value them at the time to the extent that other people would come to value them, simply because she felt that, well, I've already created it and it exists on the astral at this point. So.
Absolutely. She saw it as having an imprint in the macrocosm. And for somebody to hang on to their own creations was something that she perceived to be vanity, which is kind of ironic because she very much was devoted to being a living archetype of beauty and strength and power.
Yeah, I think there's it sounds to me from this book that we were talking about, Wormwood Star, The Magical Life of Marjorie Cameron. It sounds to me like there was probably a bit of an oscillation in this respect, at least during a set period of her life, because of the fact that she seemed to go through a period where she was struggling against some of that.
Absolutely, yes.
And trying to be more ascetic about it. At one point, cut her hair all off intentionally to counter this, I guess you could say, glamour of the path, so to speak.
That's right.
And so she was, I think Kansa describes her as having pretty much embodied Joan of Arc.
Yes, she
respect.
was very much obsessed with Joan of Arc. And it's interesting because in the Babalon Working, I'm sure that Jack Parsons had the desire to bring forth a very glamorous and, visually stunning, strong embodiment of the feminine current that he went down to describe into detail, like red flaming hair and green eyes, and here she comes, I find it very interesting that he had this deep working with LRH, as I describe off to the side, whom, later on he comes to play a very curious confidence trickster role in Jack Parsons' life. And he was somebody that for many, many years Cameron had a deep animosity toward, because she felt when they were doing the Babalon Workings, and LRH, as we will call him, was the scribe for Jack Parsons, she believed that LRH was lifting a lot of the genius of Jack Parsons' rituals for his later developed system of ascension that comes to birth itself in the Scientology religion.
Yeah, it seems as though he basically saw the OTO as a pyramid, a potential pyramid scheme in the making.
Absolutely. And Crowley picked up on this. He's like, who is this man? Like, he kind of reprimanded Jack. It's hilarious because one of my closest beloveds, who doesn't wish to be named, refers to LRH as one of the greatest chaos magicians of the 20th century, because he just life hacked right through Jack Parsons' life, literally lifted his life savings and had this whole scheme that he tried to pull Jack Parsons into, where he bought yachts and then was going to go on some sailing trip. So he proceeded to just basically lift everything out of Jack Parsons' life and went on this journey, and Cameron's freaking out, who is this man? And so anyway, just to get back to Jack Parsons, I think that he was very trusting and passionate and visionary. So he would throw himself full on into something with the desire to have success. Like I think he was trying to create another entrepreneurial business with LRH, and Cameron was always extremely suspicious of it.
Yeah, I know she resented him for years and years after Jack's death. And
in getting back to that, it would be absolutely understandable that the magnets of Cameron and Jack Parsons would draw closer. And this kind of like, with the falling out with L. Ron Hubbard, it ended up being that shortly thereafter, Jack Parsons did sell the parsonage. And this was going to start the whirlwind travel of Cameron and Jack Parsons to Mexico, I believe, like San Miguel. And
now, was it just Cameron that went there and Jack stayed behind?
Yeah, at first.
That's the way I'm picturing it.
At first, yes. But there were multiple trips down there. And I think one of the things that Cameron and Jack Parsons were striving to do was to salvage their marriage that was disintegrating at that point, because they were both extremely promiscuous. And
yeah, I think Jack was a big believer in his understanding of Crowley's system of Thelema worked and how that regarded relationships and that sort of thing. And he saw the idea of sexual or romantic jealousy as being ridiculous and childish.
And ironically, it would be Crowley that would pipe up and say, you individuals are utilizing the OTO's system for wanton hedonism and forgetting the great work.
Yeah.
So his kind of bone of contention was that nobody's doing everyone's just having this massive, like, wild bohemian escapade together.
You know, this is the funny thing. I mean, going back to Lady Frida Harris reacting to Kenneth Anger's portrayal of Thelema, and the same thing here with Crowley reacting to the Agape Lodge members' interpretation of Thelema.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to me because it seems as though you have the initial idea being set forth, and then when it's taken on by others, there's a tendency for some kind of degradation to be happening.
Yes, and it's one of those things where it's all fine and dandy to be liberating yourself in a certain way, but it can't just be all the glory. You can't be afraid to do the laundry.
Yeah.
And I think that was basically what Crowley was getting at.
Yeah, there's a balance involved, and it's not like, I mean, even in Liber Libellum, it specifically says, all this discipline may seem the opposite of freedom, but you have not yet known true freedom. So he was really emphasizing the idea of discipline being at the root of true freedom.
And so, there they are, cavorting in their Californian lodge. And it was very fascinating to see how many people's lives crossed paths being there. So while Jack Parsons was still, fiddling about with his explosive world, and
literally and metaphorically.
Oh, my heart goes to Jack. They did float around to various areas of residence. And one of the areas that they did land in LA resulted in Cameron meeting that socialite Samson DeBreer, who seemed to have been quite the catalyst in bringing a lot of people together. That is the individual through which Cameron meets Kenneth Anger and the avant-garde filmmaker Curtis Harrington, who would later go down to do the 10-minute tribute video of Cameron, Wormwood Star.
Now, this is after Jack's death, is it
It
not?
is after Jack's death, yeah.
So we have this little bit of a space. It's amazing how small it is, too. There's, in 1952, Jack dies in a tragic accident in his home, in their home, where he has his essentially illegal chemical lab that he's using to help create chemicals for explosives used in film and
That's right, in the film
that
industry.
So he has an accident there where it's terrible to think about too, because it's like this whole thing where Cameron and Jack are making all the plans and arrangements to go down to Mexico together.
Yeah, just to try to rekindle their marriage because of all of the, all of the frolicking causing so many waves of dissonance between them. They genuinely wanted to, salvage the sanctity of their union. And while Cameron was away doing whatever role or organizing or errands to prepare for that, it was Jack in a rush back at their place, trying to pull off a quick job.
Yeah.
And not having the usual steely concentration that he had in the past, just by virtue of being distracted.
Yeah.
It's not a virtue, but thanks to this distraction, this thing basically blew him to bits, which is terrifying to fathom. And he was still alive when he was found.
His whole arm had been torn off and his face was...
And they had like a mutual friend, I cannot remember the individual's name, that had found Jack in that state, and they whisked him to a hospital. And it was through that whole process that Cameron came to understand something's happened, something terrible's happened. That was a massive turning point for her life. That, ironically, for all of her resistance of the Babalon workings and speaking of Thelema and the like, it truly was the thing that catapulted her into the deep chasm of her occult transformation.
Yeah, I mean, this would have been extremely jarring. I know we were talking briefly earlier about she came to believe that the FBI might have done something.
Yeah.
This might have been some assassination, essentially, because part of the reason for them leaving was the fact that Jack was he couldn't really get work in the rocket fuel industry anymore in the States because of problems with the FBI and with his just circumstances and whatnot. So he was trying to either go to Mexico or to Israel, and he had a job offer in Israel that he was trying to nail down.
And he was working for the jet-propelled laboratories, which is actually a precursor to NASA.
Yeah.
And think about the fact that with him working in that industry, he would have exposure to the military, as Cameron did. And this is the 50s, so you've got the sort of like weird Cold War vibe.
Yeah, and even going back to they met in 46, so and both of them had been involved indirectly with World War II. Well, I guess directly, but you know what I mean. Like they weren't.
Yeah, they weren't like in the front lines.
But they were working behind the scenes towards all the technology going
That's
on.
right. Yes.
And so, like as a result of that, both of them were prone to paranoia about being spied on by the FBI. And this is a case where there's legitimate reasons for them to be paranoid about that because it was true.
And here's the thing, too.
In one capacity or another.
Here's the thing, too. Jack Parsons, just being the explorer that he was, did have a brief stint of looking into socialist paraphernalia, like publications and stuff, not because he wanted to join a communist party, just because he's expanding his mind, educating himself as to the 360-degree ambiance of the world at the time. But that was seen as something suspicious.
Yeah. Absolutely. At that time, it was...
it was like, are you engaging in scientific technology that you're going to sell to the communists? Like it was like that kind of weird,
I mean, this is the time that we get that term blacklist from, and even if he was enthusiastic about socialism in that earlier time, he certainly didn't feel that way later on. He was very much against the idea of communism. And actually, Michael and I had been doing a deep dip into his essay, Freedom is a Two-Edged Sword. That was one of our previous, actually a 2-part episode. And he's very much against the idea of communism and fascism as both trying to use freedom to convince you that they represent freedom,
Yeah.
but they actually, in fact, are truly tyranny. So he was very much against the socialist ideas that they were worried he was in support of.
And I mean, when you think of Cameron and Jack Parsons together, they were a powerhouse embodiment of freedom that was futuristic for the time. As you stated earlier, a precursor to the beat movement. That's sort of like bohemian. Everybody sitting together, exchanging intellectual thoughts and reading poetry. And by the way, Jack was a profound poet. And, later in Cameron's life, she became quite literary, a poetic herself. But her strong suit was art. Her power, her visions were her fine arts, and how their worlds came together was beautiful by the end of their lives. In Cameron illustrating Jack Parsons' personal poetic tome, Songs for the Witch Woman, which were directly inspired by Cameron as a living work of art in perpetual motion.
Which you were nice enough to bring your copy with you, and it's a beautiful, beautiful book.
I'd love to leave that here for you until we interview again so you can look through it.
Thank you so much.
But getting back to Cameron, because I want to make sure that people understand her greatness, her sensibility of art, line, form was profound. And she had many opportunities to utilize them in unconventional ways and to subsist somewhat on them, which became more of an issue after Jack's death. Where she became a wandering soul of the world.
Yeah, I think she, it seems as though the impression is that she, I suppose, got comfortable when she was with Jack, because he was kind of taking care of her and covering her expenses for her traveling and that sort of thing. And as we mentioned, he wasn't the jealous type, or at least he tried tooth and nail not to be. And so he funded her going to Mexico on her own and that sort of thing. And so I think probably when he died, she was stuck, and she was really genuinely like, how am I going to take care of myself? What am I going to do?
And there were many, many sort of like wanderings through the desert. And literally relocating to Mexico, coming back to Hollywood, like back and forth, crisscrossing the world. And a lot of times with the most frugal.
Circumstance. I think she was even, I don't know if it was in Nevada, but it was in the desert in California or Nevada or somewhere around there, where she was squatting in a place for a while. And I mean, it sounded like a good circumstance. It's kind of neat to think of these buildings that you can just kind of go hold up, and she had a life for herself, but she was very solitary.
Very solitary, and grew deeper and deeper into her witchiness. It's funny, because if we were to backtrack a little bit, Jack Parsons, when he did have his most blissful honeymoon phase with Cameron, introduced Cameron to many systems of magic and tried to encourage her to go down those roads. She did read, James Fraser's The Golden Bough, Joseph Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces. And the thing she ended up really gravitating toward, which is an interesting dovetail from Lady Frida Harris, was the tarot. The tarot, of course, she's an artist, so it spoke very deeply to her in her process. And her artistic prowess was so intense that in 1947, she was to travel to Paris because she was striving to enroll in the Académie de la Grande Chaumière in order to become a student there. And she was simultaneously going to try to seek out Crowley in England, because by this point Crowley was just like down on Parsons, like, you failed me. I don't know what you guys are doing there. This isn't a party, like
he had been calling Parsons his magical son, or he was calling him his son. At some point.
So he was his protege and everything. So Cameron was trying to get down there for two reasons: for her own artistic goals and aspirations, which goes to show the strength and independence of her spirit, but to simultaneously try to assuage this sort of like the smear campaign that
speak on behalf of Jack. Yeah.
But then, of course, 1947, she reaches there and realizes, for whatever reason, the fates did not make it destiny for her to be in that school. She was not accepted as she thought she was. And then Crowley dies.
Yeah, just before she has any chance to get there.
So she just has blow after blow. And imagine 47 all the way up to 52. You know, just after marrying Jack Parsons in 1949 or something like that. Somewhere around there. And then Jack dies.
Yeah.
So this is truly the foundation of her being the esoteric seeker. It really thrusts her into it full force. Yeah,
I think up until that point she was probably very much still kind of the earth and in the earth. Yeah. And Jack's, obsession with the occult and whatnot was not sort of hers by any means. But after the fact, she's trying to put the world back together again after it's been, blown apart for her.
Yeah, and it becomes quite a traumatic experience with her, moving into the future without her soulmate. There are many aspects of that experience that resonated deeply for me, like having that connection with your occult life partner, high priest, magical worker, teacher, etc., and have it be rent from your experience so violently. I felt deeply for Cameron. And she then goes full on into her magical path at that point. Yeah. Is that orphan of the universe, It's fascinating.
Yeah, I think she, as I mentioned before, she started to look into some of the materials that were left behind. So there was like a chest that belonging to Jack, and there was his diaries, and
his magical dagger was there as well.
And
he had made her like a talisman as well that she wore all the time as her connection to him.
Yeah, and I think there was a lot of stuff that he didn't talk to her about. He kept to himself, like including the purpose of the Babalon Working and her role in it as far as he was concerned and that sort of thing. He didn't shove that on her. No. He didn't worry her about it or anything like that. But
it's interesting though. It really made her dive more deeply into being active, disciplined, focused on creation. Yeah. So she strove to have shows here and there. She kept kept having these auspicious chance meetings with these influencers before influencers existed. These powerhouses of people of influence, one of which led her to having an exhibition in 1956, I believe, where mysteriously, as it came to happen down the road, all of her works perished in a fire in this gallery in Brentwood. And it's like this recurring answer to her consciousness of her work existing in the astral. This world kept stealing away her work in the form of fires and theft and so-called mysterious misplacements. And she ended up being on a cover of an art journal called Semina, which really exposed her to a whole other artistic community of avant-garde seers. And that she did cut off her hair.
So she appears almost as Joan of Arc.
Yes, she does. It's extremely haunting, stark.
Not the way you picture her, usually.
No.
But I'm not sure if this is what they were going for, if there's a different Latin language that they were using. But in Latin, semina means seeds.
Interesting.
I like
Yeah, that's pretty...
That's kind of a cool, especially considering the influence that, her and I'm sure other artists within it would have had.
And she had, in that particular publication, which I think was in 1955, there were all sorts of wild convergences that were happening. She came to meet her future partner, Sherry Kimmel. That's a whole other story. But in this semina work, she had the image that she portrayed following many peyote visions in the desert, as well as it was accompanied by some poetry that she wrote herself.
And this is a very provocative image. If it's the one I'm thinking of, it's the, I think it's called Peyote Vision.
Yes, it is.
And it's especially, I mean, it's provocative by today's standard if you had it hanging in a gallery or anything like that. But by the standards of the 50s, it would have been threatened by obscenity laws.
And I think when her work was shown, that particular work, which did end up causing quite a controversy. I think it did cause the art show to be shut down.
Yeah,
because of obscenity.
I think it was like one of the people there who was trying to defend the art show was like getting frustrated with the police and said, "Is this what you're looking for?" and held it up, and it's like, well, yes, that is. As a matter of fact,
the show's over. It's just like, oh, wrong move.
Yeah.
So it kind of had the opposite effect of what he was going for. But it's interesting because shortly after that, like if we fast forward to around 1961, Cameron does end up reconvening with Kenneth Anger. And it's wild because this would have been following her inauguration of the Pleasure Dome cameo, as well as as mentioned earlier, the Curtis Harrington appearance of her presence in the Wormwood Star. And these two things expanded her artistic impact because she kept having these directors be fascinated to have her have cameos in their films, whether they be shorts or the like.
Yeah.
One of which was the Curtis Harrington film after Wormwood Star, called Night Tide, where Cameron appears as this mysterious, dressed in black, witchy woman that at one point of the movie throws the evil eye into the audience, kind of having this film noir presence about it.
Yeah.
A little Hitchcocky.
Yeah, it's got Dennis Hopper in it in a very early role as well.
And it's funny, she kept meeting all these people that would go on to be heavy hitters in the cultural oeuvre of our society. She reminds me, this sounds insane, but she reminds me of the New York Dolls, who very much were proto-punks.
Yeah.
The people that open the door for other people that end up speaking louder and more organized than the ones that were actually like pulling the flame like Prometheus from the gods.
Yeah. I find those kinds of people are fascinating because they're underground. They're kind of they never quite get the same fame, but they have such an influence.
Yeah. So Cameron goes on to create many fascinating works artistically, and she strives to have some reconvergence of sorts with Kenneth Anger for them to do future projects together, but it becomes a complex thing for Cameron because she very much was a powerhouse that operated most comfortably in power roles, and so she was often perceived as strange and evil, and people were suspicious of her. And then you had all the friends that knew her more intimately, like in various artistic communities that were like, oh, you're not seeing the full spectrum of Cameron. She's very sensitive. She's a seeress. Her dreams are profound. Her visions are deep. So there was this duality that swirled around her persona.
Yeah.
That's like so naturally reflective of the artist, and also, of course, the magician, which is something we spoke about in our last interview. Like when you're deeply enrolled in the path of magic, and you're so open to your shadow self, it could be off-putting to other people. And I think she definitely lived that.
Oh, absolutely. I think she came to embody the image of the witch.
Yeah.
You know, in all its connotations, you know.
And many years of devotion to her art, and of course her drug visions, of her visions with magic mushrooms and the like. And the austerity of her life, traveling from desert to hovel to this, eventually did start to take a toll on her health. Mm-hmm. So I was profoundly blown away how she still managed to stay dedicated to her art, even in the midst of all of that. She was very ambitious with her, interestingly enough, with doing her will.
Yeah.
And how Thelemic is that, right? So.
And she did passionately identify as a Thelemite, and she came to really, in addition to having a whole different perspective on Jack Parsons in hindsight and her relationship to him and her perceived role and her understanding of herself after his death, she also came to really have a strong opinion of Aleister Crowley as well, and became very enthralled with his writings and practices and that sort of thing.
It's like she grew into him. Now, if we were to backtrack a little to the Californians of the OTO faction, she did, after Jack Parsons' death, seek like female support, a maternal protective relationship. And she did end up having that with Jane Wolfe, who was the presiding priestess of that OTO lodge at the time.
I thought that was fascinating,
I didn't really realize how deeply she went into that. And she even ended up going into the AA workings with the guidance of Jane Wolfe, which I find absolutely inspiring. I would have been fascinated to know more about that relationship. So, despite her earlier resistance, she ended up moving deeper into her path on an occult level.
Yeah, and she was doing practices of her own. She was not really... It seems like she was doing them for herself, by herself. So it wasn't the type of thing that, like, you will have her friends and people around her commenting on the fact that she would be doing these things, you know, in her own way and that sort of thing. So, but it was always there. And I mean, even like in raising her child, she ended up having a daughter, and she raised her daughter in what she perceived as being the Thelemic way. I mean, this again is one of those things that I think it's like, you can say that it's, you have Crowley's way of expounding these things, and then it sort of takes on a different form for each person who tries to go forward with it.
With all due respect to Cameron, but it took on a distorted light in her raising of her child, because it turned out that Crystal did become a very conflicted and
it didn't work.
Troubled,
you know,
individual.
I think this is child rearing is a difficult subject, and I think it's a difficult subject because none of us comes with instruction manuals, and parents are just kids who have been old enough to become parents, you know. So it's not an easy thing to be a parent, and you make your choices, and then you've made those choices, and then you end up with the consequences of that, you know.
And I mean, she ended up moving down with her daughter to like West Hollywood, around the Genesee Avenue area in LA, like toward the late 70s into the 90s, when she was officially at that point a grandmother, and etc. And I mean, this area had run into such a deteriorated state by that point, which it was once a golden age of bohemian bliss there. But I mean, bringing her daughter and grandchildren down to an area that became like a cesspool for crime and sex stores and like adult movie theaters. It's like the Babalon Ranch right there, sort of thing.
Yeah. And I guess we should mention that the way that she chose to rear her daughter Crystal was, allowing her all the freedom.
She had honorable intentions.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
she really did. She wanted her daughter to be free because, I mean, she grew up herself, Cameron, if we do the full circle back to Iowa, in an extremely strict, religious, like hardworking family, but very restricted. Very, very restricted.
Yeah, so I mean, the natural thing was to rebel against that kind of thing, and the unfortunate thing is that things never seem to work quite right when you go complete opposite.
It's
you know,
kind
you
of
have to find
like
a balance.
in the desire to free yourself from the Victorian restraints of the previous generation, things can get lost in the translation.
Yeah, and I mean, this is what we see with the whole. Initially the beat movement and then the hippie movement. We have this revolution, this massive revolution that does wonderful things, as I mentioned, and also does some terrible things.
Yeah.
And it's just, you know, the state of affairs. You can't really seem to have, you know, a complete revolution where nothing goes wrong.
Yeah. Now, you know, the good thing is, though, even down in the midst of all that sort of like chaos, she still managed to create. And even though her health was failing, she slowly started to move deeper and deeper into the mysticism of the land. So she was fully going into her deep spirituality. And she ended up practicing Tai Chi. She ended up still creating art. And at one point, like I believe it was in the late 70s, she created a series that I would love to know more about called Pluto Transiting the 12th House, about her explorations into death. And she was suffering with so many health issues that she had a little bit of a shaky hand thing going on, which is why I think it's amazing that she took up Tai Chi, because with the workings of the Chi, I believe she would have been able to have some sort of cellular regeneration of herself and help her to push her through those final visions.
Yeah.
If you've ever seen those images, you should go deeper into them. They almost look like electromagnetic frequencies caught in a radio wave.
Yeah. And I think she was starting to lose her vision over time as well.
Yeah, she was.
Yeah, which is
terrifying.
brutal for her. Yeah.
It's like the greatest nightmare of all artists.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I always think, well, okay, if I get older and physically unable to move around and stuff, at least I can read. But then what happens if, you know, if something happens to your eyesight or your,
just terrifying.
Yeah.
So she pushed it to the furthest dimensions of her capacity, and the legacy of which is profound. Like there's now very much a foundation to preserve the works of Cameron and Parsons. There's actually like an organization, like the Cameron Parsons Foundation or something like that, that exists to this day, which allows us to have a lot of her work preserved. There have been many retrospectives of her work. But getting back to The Wormwood Star by Curtis Harrington, if nobody has seen it, if anyone can maneuver over to YouTube, I highly recommend you watch the brilliant homage that Curtis Harrington put together of Cameron as an artistic force of nature. It is called Wormwood Star, with the subtitle of something like in honor of the language and knowledge, or the knowledge and conversation with the Holy Guardian Angel, as per Cameron.
Cameron.
That's not verbatim. It's I'm paraphrasing. But if you go to that video, it is the most poetic encapsulation of all of the threads of mystery that made Cameron the great artist that she is.
And not only that, but it has a lot of her artwork portrayed that most of it having been destroyed sometime afterwards.
Yes, she destroyed her own works at some point, which is just... a lot of people cried and were heartbroken. I would be too. And so this is like a testament to the work that she did. But what's really beautiful about this video is that you not only see her visual arts, but you get to witness her in basically like a performance art style of presence. There's a ritualistic presence about it, all sorts of symbolism, all sorts of like tips and nods to the mysteries through objects. And then with her own self, invoking a prayer to her holy guardian angel from her inner being. And it's seen as the ultimate alchemical transformation of the artist's struggle with putrefaction and all the various stages, the sort of like the dark connections to the mysteries of the earth, unto one's flourishing, unfolding into the phoenix of self, transmuting the base metals into gold of the artistic self, right? So I'm so grateful to Curtis Harrington for having done that, because we would not see that full spectrum of her magic.
Yeah.
And you see it in this video. I mean, her presence is striking and formidable and haunting and even menacing.
Yeah, yeah. Now, would you mind reading that little portion for us?
Sure, I would love to. And this is basically from the mouth of Cameron herself. She's calling forth unto her holy guardian angel. This is from Wormwood Star, which is actually a poem she took on as, I believe, a prayer that is connected to Jack's apocalyptic visions. And it goes as such. 7 times I rap upon the mighty door of this subterranean vault. Open, open. I stand with the draughty dark corridor that approaches thy lair. 7 times resound my summons on this stony door. In the dead Sierra caves, curse the midnight hour. Come thou forth. I bear a lamp for this terrible darkness. Thou shalt behold that face known in dreams. Mine eyes are terrible and strange, but thou knowest me. Behold, my garments are of rich cloth, and I bear the air of a land of beauty beyond the sea. Come forth. Thou art in the shadow of the light I bear, and thy garments reek of the dead in this sunless place. We shall ascend the stair that is fraught with unwholesome things. The stone road before me, and into the blazing vault of the night of nights we go forth as light. Dark star, I seek you in all the endless moons of the universe. I've entered the maze of chaos and searched the promise of no end and no fulfillment. But I have seen your helmeted head flashing gold from all the bloody triumphs and sunsets of this world. I've heard your voice singing lonely songs of desire in the world womb. I remember the artistry fingers that held the rose in wonder. Your musical flute, sounding the hymn of love, seeking the birth in the crashing star nebulae. Sing, limbs of muscle and star foam, pursued and pursuing radiant warrior. How long, in love of God, how long? How long? How long?
That's beautiful.
She blows me away. Like when I first heard that, it bawled my eyes out. It was so like, just solid. Solid, a true witch and occultist. She did grow into the very thing that I think she may have known this about herself because of the magical reality that it is to be an artist. If you recall Crowley himself saying that he would even dare to consider the artist one step above the magician because of the constant transference of vision through source. And that connection is really what the magician strives for.
Yeah.
You know. And I believe she had that.
Yeah, I think when I was thinking about her, especially having already thought about Jack Parsons and having that as a comparison, I see her as being like a force of nature.
Absolutely.
You know, it's not, it's apples and oranges in a sense, you know. So I almost worried about that in a sense, because it's like, how do you pin down that force, you know? But it's something that's really powerful, and I can see why that would reverberate over time and across so many lives.
Yes, and I'm very grateful to all the people that preserved her legacy in film and art and the like, because, of course, she carried her days to the best of her capacity until, like, at long last, by around 1995, she did pass away by that point, in her 70s. And before her death, she considered herself, which is hilarious, as Spencer Counts has said, she considered herself an honorary Thelemite and Scientologist. All right, LRH gets in there. The ultimate chaos magician. But it's just wild. And she never felt like she received the honor she should have had. Because if I'm jumping all over the place here. When she passed away, she did receive Thelemic last rites, delivered by a high priestess of the OTO. So she was sent off in ceremonial majesty, and her ashes were scattered in the Mojave Desert after her death. Yeah. So for somebody that didn't relate to the system of Thelema, it's funny, that actually was also a struggle for Lady Frida Harris. The system. Maybe they were adverse to the system in general, just on a primal level.
Yeah, I think that's what stands out to me, is that she's an example of this primal energy.
Yeah.
And so to try and pin that down using more of an intellectualization of it is futile.
Yes.
And I think that we can learn from, because that primal energy is something that helped to change the world.
Absolutely. It was that explosive catalyst that needed to happen. I mean, look at these absolute iconoclasts like Kenneth Anger and Marjorie Cameron working together. It's insane. One more volatile than the other. However, look at the great works that were born of Anger and Cameron's union.
Yeah, I think we have Crowley kind of looking down as the stern paternal figure, shaking his head at these Californian kids. And the funny thing being that I always think there's good reason for him to have been critical. But at the same time, there's this energy that you just can't control, and it's not about controlling it.
And I think that the younger generation, perhaps, this is how all generations work, really. The elders have wisdom to convey, and the youth have their own futuristic wisdom to convey back. It's the struggle of the intergenerational cooperation, the empathy for each other's place. A lot of these individuals working in California were genuinely striving in their own way to break free from the bondage of social norms.
And they did help to set the stage for future generations to make it that much easier for future youths.
Absolutely.
To be able to
those
to break
youths.
out. Those youths. Or utes, depending on how you want.
Right. Absolutely. So a profound force of nature, Cameron.
And a link in the chain leading back through all time, because she's helping to carry this energy forth as well.
That's right.
And we can still carry it forth from her.
Well, it's exciting because in 2014, actually, there was a retrospective of a show of Cameron's work in Los Angeles in the Museum of Contemporary Art in LA that was called Cameron, Songs for the Witch Woman. And it was the ultimate culmination of the work she did of poetry and fine arts that sealed the legacy of honoring the union with her soulmate, Jack Parsons.
Yeah, was that when this book that you have a copy of, that was actually finally...
Interestingly, that book I'm letting you explore, which you're going to love, it is the result of the Cameron Parsons Foundation, like that whole legacy to preserve the great works that they did together. Mm-hmm. So I'm hoping more secret little gems come out from that. I'm sure there are many people still rooting around to see what they can find that didn't perish in a fire or explode in a, in a.
Yeah.
I think
there's anecdotes of Sherry, as you mentioned, was a future husband after Jack's death. Her next husband, Sherry, had at one point, I think, when he was frustrated and jealous, threw some of his materials, Jack Parsons' materials, into the ocean.
And this was part of the struggle between Cameron and Anger. So he was noting the volatility of Cameron's life choices and struggling to get his hands on the OTO memorabilia and paraphernalia and desperately trying to...
historically important artifacts and not letting them perish,
Yeah, so I mean, one of his most beautiful installations in the Magic Lantern cycle that he did was the Lucifer Rising installation that he ended up trying to get Jimmy Page to do the soundtrack of, but that ended up in disaster. For him to only go back to his original choice, which was Bobby Beausoleil, who was in jail, unfortunately, for complications rising from his Manson connections and the murders that followed thereafter. So the soundtrack there is the work of Bobby Beausoleil. But anyway, the reason why I'm bringing that up is because even with Jimmy Page, Anger was trying to preserve the OTO memorabilia of... Crowley's estate after his death, so they were like in a bidding war.
Yeah. Is that how they met? They met at an auction.
No, I believe like through all the interconnections of like Kenneth Anger going from California over to England or France or what have you, and like being in the European world, coming back to New York. I think through all those interconnections, all these different worlds mixed of musician and artist, and it's through that. I mean, when Kenneth Anger went to London, of course, he spoke of Lucifer to the Rolling Stones, which he feels is the reason why they created their Satanic Majesty's request. So all these this is what I mean about when we started all of this, and Cameron was like right in the center of all of this.
Yeah.
I mean, through Kenneth Anger, she met Anton LaVey. And he was starstruck by her because of seeing her cameo in Night Tide. So all of these wild
you can see Kenneth Anger as being like this mercurial character who he very much identified with through Puck.
Absolutely.
And and then you can see Cameron as having her position is... Well, I mean, Babalon is the simplest way to put it, but this fiery kind of...
force of nature.
Yeah, this force of nature. And so she's putting out this energy, and then others like Kenneth Anger are running out there and like a pinball, sending it out to the world.
So my deepest respect to Cameron and her grand, shimmering legacy of gold that she created out of... extreme circumstances.
Yeah. And she, there's all these ways that she came out into the world throughout her lifetime, but it seems like that was almost in spite of her, her way of life.
It's like a higher fate was speaking through her as a current.
Yeah.
And no matter what she resisted, her greater purpose, I feel, won out which I'm so inspired by, that direct connection to the sacred.
Yeah.
Had the last word.
Yeah.
Had the last word. So.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, Rosemary.
It is always an honor and a pleasure.
93.
93.
Thank you for joining us. Look for Toronto Thelema on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Watch for events in the city. And join us again in the darkly splendid abodes.